You're listening to the Dibbly Dobbly Podcast. Remember to like, share, comment, subscribe, and click the bell to make sure you get the latest episodes of the podcast. Be sure to like and share our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and on Instagram. Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dibbly Dobbly Podcast. On today's episode of the podcast, we review the ICC Women's Cricket World Cup Final for 2022 between Australia and England from the Hagley Oval. It's the Dibbly Dobbly Podcast, and let's get started. Let's have a look at the match summary from the ICC Women's Cricket World Cup Final for 2022 between Australia and England from the Hagley Oval. Australia batted first and made 5 for 356 from their 50 overs. Healy top scored with 170 and Shrubsall took 3 wickets for England. England, in reply, were bowled out for 285. Ziver top scored with 148 not out. Jonathan and King took 3 wickets each for Australia. Australia won by 71 runs, and the player of the match was Alyssa Healy. What were the key moments and key factors from this ICC Women's Cricket World Cup final between Australia and England? Australia's batting getting to 5 for 356 from their 50 overs. The partnerships of 160 for the first wicket between Healy and Haynes and 156 for the second wicket between Healy and Mooney were crucial partnerships and contributions for Australia to reach their score of 5 for 356 from their 50 overs. Alyssa Healy's innings of 170 was very important for Australia to set the platform and the foundation for Australia to post their 5 for 356 total from their 50 overs. Australia's bowling to dismiss England for 285, which saw them win by 71 runs and win their 7th Women's Cricket World Cup title. Those were the key moments and key factors from this ICC Women's Cricket World Cup final for 2022 at the Hagley Oval. Let's have a look at both teams' performances in this ICC Women's Cricket World Cup final for 2022 at the Hagley Oval with both bat and ball. We'll start with Australia and their batters. Healy, 170, Haynes, 68, Mooney, 62, Gardner, 1, Lanning, 10, McGrath, 8 not out, and Perry, 17 not out. That's how the Australian batters went about things in this Women's Cricket World Cup final. What can you say about Australia's batting performance in this Women's Cricket World Cup final? It was a dominant display of batting from Australia. To post 5 for 356 from their 50 overs, it just shows you it was an absolute dominant display of batting from a very good Australian team who have very good players, very good batters in their side, like Healy, Haynes, Mooney, Garner, Lanning, McGrath, Perry. All of them did their roles in this final today. What I liked about Australia's innings with the bat, they were able to build big partnerships, and they had 2 very big partnerships that were very good for them in this innings. 160 for the first wicket between Healy and Haynes, and 156 for the second wicket between Healy and Mooney. Those 2 partnerships were able to lay the foundation for Australia to post a big total in the final, which they did, 5 for 356 from their 50 overs. That also allowed the other batters to come in and score runs quickly towards the end of the innings because the platform was already set by Healy, Haynes and Mooney at the top of the order, and the rest of the Australian batters and Gardner, Lanning, McGrath, Perry, they were able to come in and finish off the job and get Australia up to that 356 score. So nothing more to add on to Australia's batting performance, really. I thought it was a very dominant display. Those 2 big partnerships in particular were very important for Australia, as I mentioned before. And also, the first wicket partnership between Healy and Haynes, that's actually the highest ever opening partnership in a Women's World Cup final. The previous best was held by Rolton and Stalaker, 139 for the 4th wicket in 2005. So Healy and Haynes creating a bit of history there with their opening partnership. And Healy and Haynes, obviously, since they've been opening the partnership for Australian one-day cricket, it's been a very good opening partnership. You've got Alyssa Healy, who's the aggressor, plays her shots, and you've got Rachel Haynes, who's just the anchor, just stays in, picks the ball in the gaps, and does her role. And that's what she did in this innings with Alyssa Healy, and obviously Beth Mooney did that as well. They were able to support Alyssa Healy and give her the support in her 170. We'll talk about that in a minute. The other thing I liked about Australia's batting was they did everything right with the bat. They built partnerships, which they did, obviously with Healy and Haynes and Healy and Mooney, those two big partnerships of 150 plus. The top order got big scores. Alyssa Healy 170, then Haynes and Mooney got 68 and 62 when they batted. They rotated the strike well, did the basics right with the ball, with the bat, and they were able to score runs and really cash in on some poor bowling from England. England didn't quite get it right with the ball. Australia were able to capitalise and cash in on the poor bowling from England, which allowed them to be aggressive and play with that positive intent and look to score runs on what was a pretty good surface at the Hagley Oval for this Women's Cricket World Cup final. So pretty much it was a very good batting performance. As I said before, it's pretty much a dominant display from Australia. This Australian side, they've got some very good batters in their side, and all of them played their role today in this Women's World Cup final. Healy and Haynes and Mooney were the three main batters for Australia that really set up this score of 356 for Australia and really set them up in a very strong position in this final to win. And in the end, Australia were able to bowl England out for 280 odd and win the World Cup and win their 7th Women's World Cup. So it was a good batting performance from the Australian team in this final. Alyssa Healy, we mentioned her earlier, 170. What an innings, 170 off 138 balls. Set the foundation and the platform for Australia to get to that 356 score. Obviously, she was dropped twice during her innings. She was dropped on 41 by Nat Siver, and then she was dropped on 136. So England gave her a couple of chances there, and she made the most of it, scoring 170. Obviously, a brilliant innings, and it's probably one of the best innings we've seen in Women's Cricket World Cup history, especially in the final. Some of the records from her amazing innings of 170. It's the highest ever score in a Women's Cricket World Cup final. She surpassed Australian legend Karen Rolton, who held the record for the highest score in a Women's Cricket World Cup final, 107 not out in 2005. She's also got the record for the most runs in a single edition of a Women's Cricket World Cup. 509 Alyssa Healy scored in this World Cup in 2022. Unbelievable. Surpassing New Zealand legends Debbie Hockley's record of 456, which Hockley set in 1997 during that Women's Cricket World Cup. Alyssa Healy's 170 is the second highest score for Australia Women's ODIs after Belinda Clark's 229 not out against Denmark in Mumbai in 1997. So those were some of the records from Alyssa Healy in this brilliant knock of 170. And there's many more stats and records she's set and broken. But those are some of the records and some of the stats from her 170 in this Women's Cricket World Cup final. She was in a bit of a form slump at the start of the tournament, Alyssa Healy. She was in a bit of a form slump for some time. Her scores in this Women's Cricket World Cup, she got scores of 28, 72, 15, 3, 72, 5, 15, 129 in the semi-final against the West Indies, and then 170 in the final against England. So she was a bit out of form, but towards the end of the tournament, she was able to get back into form, and she saved her best settings for last, and that was in the final against England on the biggest stage to help Australia win their 7th Women's World Cup title. She smashes 170 and she backed herself. She plays with that positive intent. She's an aggressive player. She likes to, take the attack to the bowlers. She likes to assert her authority on the bowlers and let them know who's boss. And that's what she did in this innings. She played all around the ground. She played her shots. Some brilliant shots she played in this 170. So, yeah, brilliant innings from Alyssa Healy. Wonderful knock, and it was a very important innings from her to set up this match for Australia. And Australia were able to win this match, and it was all thanks to Alyssa Healy for her 170. I would like to mention Rachel Haynes. I think Rachel Haynes, she's been superb. Wonderful tournament from her, Rachel Haynes. She batted well for her 68. She had a good tournament with the bat, 497 runs. She had a good partnership of 160 for the first wicket between her and Alyssa Healy. Obviously, Healy and Haynes, brilliant opening partnership for this Australian team in the one-day and T20 side as well. She supported Alyssa Healy well in her innings of 170, and she just goes about her business and does her role. And she did her role today, Rachel Haynes. Magnificent tournament, and also a very good knock in the final. Also, I'd like to mention Beth Mooney. She goes underneath the radar, Beth Mooney. She doesn't get a lot of attention like Rachel Haynes or Alyssa Healy or, Meg Laddin or Elise Perry, for example, in this Australian team. She goes under the radar, she does her role, and she did it again in the final. 62, brilliant innings, supported Healy well in her innings of 170. A good partnership with Alyssa Healy of 156 for the second wicket. So I thought Beth Mooney did a very good job in this final to help set up this match for Australia and lead them to another World Cup title. So, pretty good batting performance. There's nothing much to add on to that. It was an absolute dominant display of batting from Australia. Overall, it was a good batting performance from Australia in this Women's Cricket World Cup final. Alyssa Healy stole the show and produced one of her greatest innings ever in a Women's Cricket World Cup final to help Australia post a mammoth total of 5 for 356 from their 50 overs to help Australia secure their 7th Women's Cricket World Cup title. Let's have a look at Australia's bowling performance in this ICC Women's Cricket World Cup final for 2022. Gardner took a wicket for McGrath, 3 wickets for Jonathan, 3 wickets for King, 2 wickets for Schutt, and no wickets for Brown. That's how the Australian bowlers went about things in this Women's Cricket World Cup final. I thought Australia's bowling in the final was pretty good. They bowled good lines and lengths and were consistent in their lines and lengths throughout this bowling performance. At times, they didn't quite get it right with the ball, but they were able to make corrections and get back onto that good line and length and were able to be consistent from then on in. They were able to build pressure with the ball to the England batters, which England didn't do to the Australian batters. Australia were able to build pressure on the England batters, build pressure with dot balls, maidens, and also wickets, which really put England under pressure in the run chase, and England lost wickets, and they couldn't get any momentum going in their innings. So the Australian bowlers were able to pick up wickets when needed. They kept calm, stuck to their plans with the ball, and didn't panic. And they executed their skills well with the ball, and they were able to get the job done. Everyone played their role, everyone played their part, and they were able to pick up wickets when needed. Even when England were starting to build a partnership, they kept their calm, kept their nerve, they stuck to their plans, they stuck to their processes, they stuck to their methods, they backed themselves, and they got the job done. So it was a very good bowling performance from Australia. Nothing more to add on to that, really. They bowled good lines and lengths. They were consistent with their lines and lengths throughout the innings. At times, they got a bit off their lines and lengths and they were a bit inconsistent, but they were able to make the corrections and get back to that good line and length. And as I said, they were able to build pressure and take wickets, and England crumbled. They lost wickets. They couldn't really get going in their batting innings. And Australia were able to take wickets, build pressure with dot balls, maidens, wickets, and all of the bowlers from this Australian team performed their role, played their role, and did a very good job. Jess Jonathan, Alana King leading from the front, taking 3 wickets each. They've been very good for some time in this Australian team. Talia McGrath and Ash Gardner chipped in with a wicket each. Megan Schutt, the veteran, doing her job, picking up 2 wickets. Darcy Brown, the young up-and-coming fast bowler, didn't take any wickets, went for 57 runs, but, she's been pretty good in this tournament. she's done well with the ball since she's come into the Australian side. So all the Australian bowlers executed their role, played their role, and were able to get the job done and get the wickets and bowl England out, and Australia were able to win the match. So overall, it was a good bowling performance from Australia in this Women's World Cup final. Overall, it was a dominant performance from Australia in this Women's Cricket World Cup final. They have shown everyone why they are the best women's cricket team in the world. After losing the semi-final against India in the 2017 Women's Cricket World Cup, they were determined to make amends in 2022 in New Zealand. They went through the entire 2022 tournament, not losing a single game, to win their 7th Women's Cricket World Cup title. Let's have a look at England's team performance with both bat and ball in this ICC Women's Cricket World Cup final for 2022 at the Hagley Oval. We'll start with their batters: Beaumont, 27, Wyatt, 4, Knight, 26, Ziver, 148 not out, Jones, 20, and Dunkley, 22. That's how the England batters went about things with the bat in this Women's Cricket World Cup final. What can you say about England's batting performance in this Women's Cricket World Cup final? It was very disappointing and poor. To be bowled out for 285 and 43.4 overs, chasing 356, was always going to be a challenge for England. But unfortunately for England, they just couldn't get any momentum going with their batting whatsoever. No one really got in and got set. The only one who did was Nat Ziver. She made 148 not out. But the rest of the England batters, they weren't able to get partnerships going, and they weren't able to get in and get set into their innings. England lost wickets at regular intervals throughout their innings: 1 for 12, 2 for 38, 3 for 86, 4 for 129, 5 for 179, 6 for 191, 7 for 206, 8 for 213, 9 for 278, and all out for 285, which didn't help England in their batting innings in this final. When you lose wickets at regular intervals, it's very hard to get that momentum into your innings. And for England, they just kept losing wickets. And Nat Ziver was batting quite well. Obviously, we'll talk about her in a minute with her 148 not out in this final for England. But no one could really go with her and build partnerships with her. She was at the other end. England were losing wickets at the other end while Nat Ziver was out there. That comes to the next thing we're going to talk about. England's batting didn't build any partnerships. Didn't really build any big partnerships like Australia did with Alyssa Healy, Rachel Haynes, and Beth Mooney. They all built big partnerships for Australia. They had 2 partnerships that were over 150, whereas England didn't have any partnerships that were over 100. The partnerships they had in their innings were 12, 26, 48, 43, 50, 12, 15, 7, 65, and 7. And as I said before, they needed 2 big partnerships if they were able to chase down Australia's 356 total, because it's very important in batting to build partnerships and be able to build partnerships and back up partnerships. What we saw in the Australian innings, we saw that from Healy, Haynes and Mooney. They were able to build back-to-back partnerships and get big partnerships for Australia, whereas England did not get big partnerships in their innings, which was the disappointing factor to their batting. Because if they had 2 big 100-run partnerships like Australia, for example, and if Nat Ziver had any support and built big partnerships with the rest of the England batters, then England would have had a good chance of chasing down the 356 runs. It would have been a very tight run chase. But unfortunately for England, the lack of partnerships, the lack of big partnerships didn't really help them in the run chase, because when you're chasing a big total, you need 1 or 2 good partnerships to really get majority of the runs, so you have a good chance of chasing down the runs. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case for England in the final. I mentioned Nat Ziver. Let's talk about her. What a magnificent innings. 148 not out in a losing team in a World Cup final. She'll be disappointed that she didn't quite get the team over the line, but I think she should be proud of her efforts. She fought well. She played a very good knock. She was composed. She was calm compared to her other England batters. I think she was the only one that really handled the pressure. She knew what she needed to do. She was calm. She was relaxed. She didn't panic. And she played a very good innings of 148 not out. As I mentioned before, it was pretty much her doing all the work. Unfortunately, the other England batters like Beaumont, Wyatt, Knight, Jones, and Dunkley couldn't really build a partnership with her. And they got out. They got starts. Beaumont, 27, Wyatt missed out. Knight got 26, Jones, 20, Dunkley, 22. So they all got starts, but they weren't able to stay in, convert those starts into a big score, and really support Nat Siver. So that's the disappointing factor for England, that no one was able to support her because she was batting magnificently. But unfortunately for England, they kept losing wickets. She was out there. She couldn't control the wickets that were falling from the other end. And that's where England sort of went wrong in this run chase. As soon as they lost wickets, they didn't really quite get back into the match. And unfortunately, they were able to not get back into the match. They lost that momentum. Australia were able to bowl well and get the wickets and bowl them out and win the match and obviously win the World Cup. So for England, they'll be disappointed that no one supported Nat Siver because she couldn't do it by herself. She nearly did. But unfortunately, she needed that support from others to really get England into this run chase and give them a good chance of chasing down the runs. Unfortunately, they didn't quite do that. But we have to acknowledge it was a very good knock. Obviously, Alyssa Healy, with her 170 in Australia's innings, will obviously be the innings that people remember and talk about. But with Nat Siver's knock, we should also mention it and remember this knock as well, because it was a very good effort from her. Obviously, in a World Cup final, to try and get her team over the line. Unfortunately, her team was under pressure, losing wickets. She was able to be that constant force in the batting for England, to just stay in, build a big score, which she did, and hopefully get England over the line. Unfortunately, it wasn't to be, but it was a magnificent innings and wonderful knock from her. She'll be disappointed not to get the job done, but she should be proud of what she achieved in this World Cup final. To score 148 not out in a Women's Cricket World Cup final is a pretty good effort, if you ask me, and she batted very well. Unfortunately, she didn't have the support from the other batters in the England side, which will be the disappointing factor for England in this final. Also, the other thing that may have affected England in this run chase is pressure. Now, runs on the board in a World Cup final are always good to have, and Australia had the runs on the board. For England, they had to chase down 356. It wasn't going to be easy. It was always going to be hard. And I think the England batters, they weren't able to cope with that pressure. Obviously, a lot of these players for England played in the last World Cup final, which England won in 2017. They've got that experience of playing in a World Cup final before, whereas other players like Dunkley and Charlie Dean, etc., they didn't really play in a World Cup final before. This was their first time playing in a World Cup final. So obviously, new players playing in a World Cup final for the first time, a lot of pressure, a lot of expectations. Unfortunately, England didn't quite handle that pressure all that well. And we saw that in the run chase where they lost wickets and didn't really get going in the run chase whatsoever. So they'll be disappointed, England, with their performance with the bat. They're a much better side than what we saw in this World Cup final. They've definitely got a lot of good batters who can score a lot of runs, like Beaumont, Wyatt, Knight, obviously Nat Siver, Jones and Dunkley. They can all score runs. Unfortunately, it wasn't their night. It wasn't their day. Didn't quite execute, and unfortunately for England, they came across a brilliant Australian side that outplayed them with both bat and ball in this final, and they did. Overall, it was a poor batting performance from England. They'll be disappointed in the way they batted. If they didn't lose wickets at regular intervals and built partnerships, then they would have had a chance of chasing down these runs. Unfortunately, it wasn't quite their day with the bat. Let's have a look at England's bowlers and their performance in this ICC Women's Cricket World Cup final for 2022. Siver didn't take any wickets. No wickets for Brunt. A wicket for Eccleston. No wickets for Cross and Dean. and 3 wickets for Strubsall. That's how the England bowlers went about things in this Women's World Cup final. England's bowling in this final wasn't their greatest performance with the ball. It was quite poor. Their lines and lengths were inconsistent at times to the Australian batters, and the Australian batters were able to punish England's poor bowling, and Australia were able to get to that big score of 356 when they were batting. And that really put England on the back foot in this final. Didn't quite execute their skills with the ball, England. Their execution was off with the ball. Didn't build pressure on the Australian batters. They weren't able to build pressure with dot balls and maidens and really put the Australian batters like Healy, Haynes and Mooney under pressure. They weren't able to do that. There were too many boundary balls, too many poor balls, and the pressure wasn't built up at all. So they struggled to build the pressure on the Australian batters, England, with the bowl. Didn't take wickets at regular intervals throughout the innings to slow Australia down. And that was the problem for England in this World Cup final, is that they couldn't take wickets at regular intervals. Because if you take wickets at regular intervals and you take wickets, that slows the run rate down. It brings a new batter to the crease. They have to take time to get in and get set and build another partnership with their partner at the other end. Unfortunately for England, they weren't able to do that. They weren't able to take wickets at regular intervals to slow Australia down because the pitch at the Hagley Oval was pretty good for batting. It was a pretty good surface. I think some of the players said it was an absolute road. It was pretty good for batting, and Australia made the most of it. Unfortunately for England, they didn't quite execute their skills or their plans with the ball. They just had one of those days where nothing seems to go right. And that happens in cricket, where you have good and bad days. On the good days, you're able to execute with the ball, able to score runs, for example, with both bat and ball. But you have some days where you struggle and nothing seems to be going right or according to plan. And we saw that in this World Cup final for England. When they bowled, nothing really went to plan. Australia were hitting them to all parts of the Hagley Oval, pretty much 360 around the ground. There were leaking runs. It was a pretty good pitch. As I said before, didn't quite execute the skills with the ball, didn't build pressure, and didn't take wickets at regular intervals. And Australia were able to build big partnerships. Healy, Haynes, and Mooney were able to come together and build big partnerships. And those 2 big partnerships that Australia had of over 150 plus pretty much set them up for this World Cup final, really, with the bat in the first innings of this match. And for England, that's where the game became a bit difficult for them to try and come back and win this game, because they were already on the back foot after conceding 356 runs in the first innings. It's never good when you concede over 350, especially in a one-day match, but especially in a World Cup final as well, because chasing runs in a World Cup final is always going to be difficult. And that's what we saw with England, and we talked about that earlier. When we talked about England's batting performance, they struggled, lost wickets, and they weren't able to get the job done. Their bowling was poor, and they just had one of those days where nothing went to plan, nothing seemed to go right. I heard over the stump mics they were a bit frustrated when Australia were hitting boundaries, 4s and 6s. They were frustrated, they were angry, and just upset that nothing really went to plan, and all the plans they had didn't really work to the Australian batters. And Healy, Haynes and Mooney were able to cash in on some poor bowling at times. I think also it doesn't help when you drop catches. And England did drop a few catches in the bowling performance, especially in the field. As the old saying goes, catches win matches. But if it's in a World Cup final, catches do win matches. Apparently, in this World Cup final, they dropped Rachel Haynes on 47. Tammy Beaumont dropped her. And in the same over when Rachel Haynes was dropped, they dropped Alyssa Healy on 41. Nat Siver dropped her in the same over as the Rachel Haynes catch. And then, obviously, England dropped Alyssa Healy again on 136, much towards the back end of her innings and towards the back end of the Australian innings. They dropped her again on 136. Obviously, if England took those chances, it could have been a different result in this match. But hindsight's a wonderful thing. But unfortunately, they weren't able to take the chances. Rachel Haynes went on to make 60-odd. Alyssa Healy was dropped on 41 by Nat Siver. She goes on to make 170, which is the highest ever score in a Women's Cricket World Cup final by any women cricketer in the history of the women's game. And Australia were able to post 356, which was a very good score, batting first in a final. Runs on the board, you put the opposition under pressure, and that's what happened to England in this match. So it didn't quite go to plan, as I mentioned before, for England. Drop catches don't help. And I think the pressure of bowling first in a World Cup final, probably England, they didn't quite handle that pressure all that well. Heather Knight decided to bowl first in this match, in the final. Usually you like to bat first and put runs on the board, but she said, we'll have a bowl first. We'll try and restrict Australia to a score of 250 maybe, or something like that in the final, and back ourselves to chase it down in the evening time where the dew comes in and it's much easier for batting. Maybe the pressure of bowling first. When you usually bowl first and you win the toss and bowl first, you've got to take early wickets. And England didn't do that. They didn't take early wickets, as I mentioned before. They couldn't take wickets at regular intervals and slow the Australian batting down, because Australia were able just to keep going, play aggressively, play with a positive intent and mindset, and that's what they did. So I think the pressure of bowling first, the England bowlers didn't quite handle that. And you got to take wickets early, and they didn't do that. So maybe the pressure of bowling first played on their minds, but at the end of the day, it was poor execution, didn't quite get it right with the ball, and it wasn't their day at the end of the day. Simple as that, wasn't their day. They got outplayed by a very good Australian team that batted well and bowled well at the end of the day, and deserved to win their 7th Women's Cricket World Cup title. Overall, it was a poor bowling performance from England. They didn't quite get it right with the ball in this Women's Cricket World Cup final. Overall, it was a disappointing performance from England in this Women's Cricket World Cup final. They will be disappointed in the way they batted and bowled in this final, but they should be proud of their efforts in this Women's Cricket World Cup. After losing the first 3 games to then winning the next 4 to qualify for the semi-finals and make it to the final is a great achievement. What a ICC Women's Cricket World Cup final for 2022 we have seen at the Hagley Oval. Congratulations to Australia on winning their 7th Women's Cricket World Cup title. By far the best team in this Women's Cricket World Cup, and they deserved their victory. What a ICC Women's Cricket World Cup 2022 we have seen here in New Zealand. This edition of the Women's Cricket World Cup is by far one of the best Women's Cricket World Cups we have ever seen. We saw some fantastic games of cricket that went down to the wire. We saw some of the emerging talent coming through in the women's game. We also saw some brilliant performances from the bat and the ball. Once again, congratulations to Australia on winning the ICC Women's Cricket World Cup for 2022. Well, that's all the time we have for this episode. Be sure to subscribe and click the bell to get the latest episodes of the podcast, and like and share our Facebook page, and follow us on Twitter and on Instagram. Until next time, keep safe, and bye for now.